Okay, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Matt Ron. I coach at Pitchers High School. I'm a speech coach that fell in love with world school debate because it sort of follows the format of the debate I used to do in college, NEDA, policy debate. But what is great about this event is that you can grab kids from all types of walks of speech and debate and put them in this event and they'll be successful. I'm not using any debaters, well, kind of, in this. Olivia does DI and prose, and Lynn does DI and scripted duo, and Lauren does Congress and discussion. Zane does scripted duo and prose, Lauren does OO and extemp, and Evan does extemp and impromptu. So there's a wide variety of styles here. And I'm hoping to show that speech kids can do this, and this would be a great event in debate that speech kids can go into. I did pass out a little sheet, and I'm not going to read it to you. I'm just going to go over some of the highlights, but it's basically, it lays out the format of world school debate. Things that you need to know, there are prepared motions and there are impromptu motions. A prepared motion is the kids know in advance what motions are going to happen, but they only happen once, right, in a tournament. So a prepared motion only happens once, and then there will be another prepared motion. Then there's the impromptu motions. In the impromptu motion, the kids get 60 minutes to do research, and they can only use 2 sources, and they have to be book sources, so like the World Almanac and Black's Law Dictionary, or something like that that they can use to bring and to discuss. So an example of an impromptu topic was the first one they did at Nationals this year was, an asteroid is about to hit Earth, would you tell the world? And so they debated that, okay? On this piece of paper, like I said, I gave you the format. I also gave you some websites in the back that I found useful. I've also given you a ballot that is used at the Nationals. And if you look at the back, they sort of explain what it's all about. But what they're judged here is a little bit different than like a regular debate round. It is in style, content, and strategy. So those are broken up in 3 parts, and that's how they are scored. I thought that the best way to show you guys or to explain this to let you guys see one in action. We're going to condense the time. Instead of being the 8 minutes, we're going to do 6-minute speeches and then 3-minute replies. What you'll also see is they will be standing to do the cross-examination. It's got a point of information. So they'll stand up and they'll say point, and the speaker can either take the question or they can sit them down, that they're not going to take it. And one last thing, this is great to use in class, like for any class, English, or I use it in my AP seminar class. It's a great format that kids enjoy doing, and it's easy to learn. There's not a lot of rules to it, so I highly recommend this for classroom activities also. So, without further ado, we are debating, and all of the debates will be a motion. So the motion today is, in order to allow poi and declamation, poi and informative, the IHSFA should eliminate prose and declamation. Let me get over here.
Speech has been a prominent figure in my high school career. Speech brought out the public speaker in me and showed me how to present myself in a professional manner. I took these valuable skills I learned and was able to apply them to my own life, as in presenting to a class or just interacting with people in general. But one of the best decisions I made in my speech career was moving to a memorized event. I had previously performed in prose, and it is a great event, but it restricted me on many levels. Moving to DI allowed me to perform and engage with my audience and allowed me to expand my opportunities of competition. We should give these opportunities to everyone. We stand with the proposition of today's motion, which reads, this House believes that in order to add poi and informative speaking, we should eliminate prose and declamation. To begin, I will define some terms for today's debate and introduce the burden for team opposition. First, we define eliminate to mean remove from all forensic tournaments, including held by the IHSFA, including sectional and state meets. Secondly, we place the burden on team opposition for this debate. They must prove that 1, it is not necessary to remove any speech events, or 2, that prose and declamations are more important than any other 2 events. Now on to our arguments. Our contentions are as follows. 1, it is necessary to remove 2 events from the IHSFA tournaments. Second, prose is very similar to multiple events, including poi. Third, declamation is an event that has lower value than other events, and for all these reasons, we are proud to propose. Our first argument is that it is necessary to eliminate 2 events from the IHSFA tournaments. By doing this, it keeps a level playing ground for all schools, and it allows the tournament to continue to run smoothly. One of the main problems with this is it is important that coaching can still be feasible. With more events being added, it can create a strain on the coaches. Already 14 events is difficult, but adding 16 would create even more of a strain. And if we keep it at 14, coaches can be more versatile in the events, including the 2 new ones being added. And eliminating the 2 can narrow focus and allow coaches to be more specialized, which can allow their contestants to become more specialized in these same events also. Another thing is that state and sectional meets would be very long. They're already very long days in general, and adding 2 more events could lengthen the day, as tabulating and judges and more contestants would just create the day much longer, and even adding a longer award ceremony. Our second argument is that prose is unnecessary. Prose relates to many other events that already exist to students, and it does not provide the same opportunities to those contestants. Because of this, prose should be one of the 2 events eliminated from the IHSFA. Prose is already a scripted version of HI or DI, which are basically memorized humorous events or dramatic events. And prose does offer a wide range, but those pieces that can be performed in prose are very interchangeable with the ones in HI or DI. So it would make no sense having one event that is just a scripted version of 2 other events. And prose does not provide the same real-world skills that the other events provide. For example, well, as stated, prose is a scripted event. You have a book in front of you and you must read from it. But a lot of contestants could end up just staring at their book and not engaging with the audience the whole time.
Point.
Yes.
Isn't poi also a scripted event as well?
Yes, but it is a combination of many other events. It allows more interpretation, unlike prose. And poi, you can still engage in the audience. With prose, you can do that also, but with prose, it creates more of a strain to be looking down at your book. Like, I used to perform in prose, and one of my critiques that I always got was I wasn't looking down at my book enough. I was trying to engage more with my audience and create a deeper meaning, but the book was a crush to me. And it can become that way with many other contestants, as it doesn't allow them to engage or perform their piece as widely as they could in DI or HI. Another point is that prose doesn't require as much preparation or skills that other events can provide. Like prose, again, you just stand there and read your piece. But, yes?
Do you still have to cut your prose before you perform?
Yes, but as in DI or HI or many other not scripted, but many other events, you must cut your piece. And prose is just one of them, but you don't perform as much. That stated, you do not need as much of blocking or engaging with the audience, which could not provide that same sense as other events can provide. prose does not provide a gateway to other competitions. By having poi instead of prose in other events, you can grow your poi throughout the year and be able to compete in other events as districts or nationals. But prose, you cannot do that. And with HIRDI, you still have the opportunity to compete in sectional or state or go on to other competitions like districts or nationals.
Point.
Yes.
But for an HIDI, you also still have the same manuscript the whole year?
Yes, but it's not with you, and you can still add on to it and add more blocking. And
Time.
thank you.
You were in protected time, just letting you know. Oh, by the way, you're hearing me clap back here, Mac. That 1 minute, the first minute is protected and the last minute is protected. They shouldn't be asking questions during that time.
The opposition is here today to oppose the motion that states, this House believes that in order to add poi and informative speaking, that the IHSFA must eliminate prose and declamation as events. Before we begin, the opposition would like to define eliminate to mean that in all IHSFA sanctioned speech events, prose and declamation will be removed in favor of poi and informative. We'd also like to define poi as a program oral interpretation of thematically linked selections chosen from 2 or 3 genres, which include poetry, prose, and/or drama. I will be describing the opposition's first 2 contentions, which are as follows. Prose and declamation should be kept as they are good gateway events for newcoming members or those new to the speech community to then grow in their speech career and go to other events, as well as that instead of eliminating prose for poi, we instead eliminate poetry. My partner will be presenting our third contention, which is that for informative, we combine both the extents. Coming into a high school with 1,500 people with numerous talents and abilities, joining the speech team my freshman year was a pretty infeasible task. I didn't try out that year. For next year, I tried out my sophomore year, and I was trying out for HI. Now, an HI is a memorized event in which you have to have a number of different characters. I found a piece, I had it cut pretty well, but then I couldn't figure out how to do my characterization or how to portray myself to get that across. Prose can do that for me. A prose is much like HI and DI in the sense that it's a scripted event that is, it can be any range of topics that's a play or a drama. In a way, prose and declamation are like the junior varsity team in sports in the sense that, as I've stated, they lay the groundwork for more events and future prosperity. Prose is an event that allows the participant to use a short story, parts of a novel, or other published works of prose. Students then provide their own oral interpretation on that selection of materials. The only difference with prose against HI and DI is prose as a script, which can act almost as a crutch, which in a good sense in the fact that if for a newcomer, unexperienced member, they can look at the script and still provide a pretty decent interpretation, which then leads.
Point.
Yes?
Well, if you're preparing students to be in these memorized events, shouldn't they be practicing learning those memorization techniques?
Yes, that is a good idea, but as what we're trying to say is prose is good for beginners and newcomers, because jumping into an event that is memorized, it is not necessary for them to act necessarily know how to memorize, because they don't have experience with what prose does, which is like HI and DI. You still have to cut, find characters, as well as present them. It is better for newcomers to then get used to that before they jump right into an event that is memorized with the same characteristics. As I was saying, moving on to declamation. Declamation is an event much like an OO in the sense that for declamation, you have to research a social topic and find the speech that was presented by another person. That the participant then gives their interpretation of the declamation person. Furthermore, this interpretation skill that is found in both prose and declamation is vital to excel a career later on in speech that can lead to HI, DI, and OO. Our second contention is that in order to keep prose, we should cut out poetry instead. Poetry is characterized by writing that conveys ideas, that has a rhythmic flow, and often characterized by an iambic pentameter. The opposition believes that by limiting the selection to poetry, and poetry alone, it is really an exclusive event that can limit the number of students who can participate in the speech team. We also believe that as poetry pieces can be used in poi, it is rather redundant to have an event that's just dedicated to poetry and poetry alone. The rhythm that is required by meter is difficult still to learn and is only pertinent to the poetry piece itself. For many people in the speech community, it's difficult to learn how to speak in rhythm as well as to have a tone to present their idea and manner in a way that's beneficial. and thusly it is an unskilled event in the sense that it cannot be applied to other events such as HI and DI, which prose can do. Although poetry is an event in POI, you can still use poetry in POI but not have a specific event dedicated to it. Therefore, those who are good at poetry can incorporate that into their POI. In conclusion, the opposition would like to reiterate that we contend that prose and declamation should be kept as they are good gateway events and help with inclusivity of speech team, and as well as to keep prose, we should instead eliminate poetry. Thank you.
I am the second speaker in today's debate for the team proposition, which stands in favor of today's motion, which reads, this House believes that in order to add poi and informative speaking, the IHSFA must eliminate prose and declamation. To begin, I will perform a brief rebuttal over the points brought up by team opposition, and then I will move into our third contention, which is that DEC is a weaker interp event and should therefore be eliminated. To begin, I would like to start with their first point, which is how prose and declamation are gateway events into other events. However, we believe that it's important for students to go ahead and get first-hand experience in these new events. They say how prose is very similar to HI and DI, and we completely agree. So it's unnecessary to have this extra event that is so similar to two other events that they can already get experience and learn the techniques that are unique to HI and DI, as opposed to having to learn the rules and techniques of prose and then having to later transition that. Why not just go ahead and give them the first-hand experience that they need? Secondly, they explain how prose is good, prose and declamation are good for newcomers. They're an easy event to jump into. However, according to SpeechWire, the prose reading competition in the sectionals competition in 2015 had 126 competitors, which is a lot. Prose is one of the most populated events, so that in itself makes it more difficult to be successful in. Yes?
So wouldn't cutting one of the most popular events not to be beneficial to the speech community?
We're saying we cut it because it's unnecessary. There are other events that these people could go transition into that are already less populated, and so they'd have a better chance of being successful. In addition, prose is not solely for newcomers. There are plenty of experienced individuals who compete in prose, and that on top of the high amount of competitors makes prose actually very difficult to be successful in, and therefore would be a bit discouraging to newcomers. Secondly, they talk about how DEC provides the skills of cutting. Yeah, every single interp event has the skills of cutting. You can see that in all the events and learn how to pick out points and find the most important arguments and learn that through all the other events. Again, declamation is not as necessary.
Point?
Yes.
When did we discuss declamation in our first two contentions?
You said you should keep it because it is teaching students how to cut and keep points.
We said we should keep it, but we didn't discuss our third contention, or why we should keep it.
Okay, your first speaker mentioned something about prose and being able to pull points from it. Their second contention was about poetry and its exclusivity and its difficulty. However, by adding poi, poetry would only be similar to one event. However, prose is similar to two. So prose already has more events that it's similar to, therefore making it unnecessary. And poetry and poi actually teach a lot of very unique, very important skills. They teach the skills of analyzing other arguments and putting them together to form a cohesive program that works together to make an argument. And that is more important than simply learning a plotline or something like that. Now I will move into our third contention, which is how declamation is this event that has sort of a lower value and is one of the weaker interp events. What we mean by this is that it does not demonstrate any unique skills. The main focus of declamation is speech proficiency and being able to communicate with the audience. The National Speech and Debate Association states that the goal of declamation is to convey a message with clarity, emotion, and persuasiveness. But again, as I stated earlier, that can be seen through all the other speech events, whether it be interp or OO or limited prep. And so again, we see this very similar to prose in that it's kind of a lack of difficulty. It's simply reciting to an audience. And because of that, it's simply unnecessary when there are other unique skills that are being taught and learned in other events that are more important. So to continue that, I'd like to discuss how other interview events have these unique events. Through interview events, you have the ability to create your own characters, which is a unique experience and a unique skill that is important to learn how to convey yourself in different ways. In OO and informative speaking, you have the ability to write your own speech and express your own opinions or opinions you favor with in that way, as opposed to just using someone else's speech.
Point.
And in addition, limited prep, which is a really important event, really teaches the skills of quick thinking, being able to look at articles quickly, specifically for STEP, and being able to pull out those important points and form an argument to persuade your audience. And those are skills that we should be encouraging kids to learn, not just being able to memorize and recite to an audience. So, because of our reasons that it is necessary to remove 2 events from the IHSFA in order for feasibility, both for coaches and for larger tournaments, and for the reason that prose is very similar to 2 events. It's similar to HI and DI, so it should be eliminated because it, and in addition, it's similar to POI, so that's 3 events that prose would actually be similar to and therefore should be eliminated. And thirdly, how DEC is a weaker interview event that does not teach many valuable skills that are seen through all of these new events. We believe that prose and declamation should be eliminated for POI and informative speaking. Thank you.
I would just like to state that I am the second speaker on team opposition, the team that stands opposing the motion that in order to make room for POI and informative, the IHSFA must remove declamation and prose interpretation. I will first begin with a brief rebuttal of team proposition's 3 contentions before moving into an elaboration of our 3rd contention, which involves the combining of both international extemporaneous speaking and domestic extemporaneous speaking into one collective extemporaneous speaking that follows the collegiate model. Now, to begin with a brief rebuttal of team proposition's 3 contentions, I myself did prose my first year in speech. I was an 8th grader, and prose interpretation really helped me get used to the style of speech in general. I had never heard of speech, I had never done speech before, and I know that is a common theme among several newcomers to the speech community. And prose was an event that genuinely helped me understand not only the format of speech meets, but what it means to be a speech competitor and what necessarily that entails. Secondly, their first contention says that it is not feasible to create 16 events. However, when they presented the burden to us, we were given the opportunity to either say that it was feasible to have 16 events or to provide a counter-action plan that involves the removal of 2 other events. Since we have chosen the latter, with a counter-action that involves the removal of 2 events, their first point is completely arbitrary and invalidated. Lastly, DEC is not necessarily an interpretation event, but instead is classified under public address. That is a set of events that are completely their own entity, something that typically involves declamation, original oratory, and yes?
We're not saying it is an interview event, we're saying it's very similar to those events, and it resembles those more clearly.
Well, team proposition did say in their contention that it was a weaker interp event. And I would just like to clarify that it is a public address event, and it is not necessarily geared toward helping students in HI and DI, but rather it is geared to helping students move themselves towards original oratory, or in this case, informative speaking. By encouraging more students to do declamation, we are laying a groundwork basis for students to not only bridge themselves into OO, but to informative speaking as well.
Point.
Yes.
Couldn't people that would want to get into OO later actually be entered in novice OO or promise informative speaking if they're beginners?
Perhaps, but the fact that novice competitions aren't necessarily as popular in the speech community as several other tournaments are as well, it wouldn't necessarily be feasible to only have them compete novice at very few meets. Similarly, Declamation also provides those necessary skills that they were discussing to create an argument. It just does so in a different manner. Oftentimes when a student does a declamation, that student strongly believes the ideas that are presented in that declamation. They just might not be at a level where they feel comfortable expressing those ideas as their own, and instead need to work through a person in order to be comfortable with that themselves. That way, when it comes to a declamation, the student will have to cut the piece and have to highlight those specific examples of an argument that are the most important to the speech. Something that is not only beneficial for informative speaking and original oratory, but something that is increasingly beneficial to life in general. As in almost any profession, a student at one time will have to analyze and pick out the strongest points of an argument in a peer review. This is also incredibly prevalent in poetry and prose and several other of these events, like our competitors have brought up. However, it is not necessarily that same style that it would be in a declamation, an informative, or an original oratory, which highly resemble those of TED Talks and that follow that similar academic style presented in peer reviews. Lastly, the team proposition requests the removal of prose so that students can feel as though they are being more successful in speech. And several of their contentions have involved what is necessary in order to make students feel successful. However, if we make speech something that is extrinsically motivated by how well you can do, how many ribbons you can get, or how successful you are, you degrade the value and integrity of speech. Because speech is meant to help students garner more self-worth, garner more self-confidence, and overall present a speaker that is more confident in their...
How are you going to feel more confident if constantly the judges are telling you that you're not doing well by your placement? Isn't that going to devalue your confidence? Personally, by winning, I've had much more confidence in myself.
Well, considering that winning seems to be the only thing that motivates team proposition to feel good about themselves, sometimes it's just seeing how far you can come, not necessarily just by getting a ribbon to prove that you did good speech. Now, to conclude, I would just like to say that by showing the team opposition, I would like to present team opposition's third contention, which involves combining both domestic extemporaneous and international extemporaneous speaking into one extemp that follows the collegiate model. One round domestic, one round international, and one round economics to tie all three bases of extemp together. It provides all three levels of analysis for extemp and creates a well-rounded, informed speaker that is involved on three separate topics. This way, the student will be able to expectively analyze all three different types of analysis and present themselves in a professional manner that follows a collegiate level as well. Thank you.
So first, I'd like to begin with saying that I am the third speaker for team proposition, which favors the motion that states that in order to add POI and informative speaking to the IHSFA tournaments, the IHSFA should eliminate declamation and prose. So to begin, I will analyze my opponent's arguments and claim why they are wrong. And secondly, I will elaborate on my team's arguments and claim why we clearly have the upper hand in this argument today. So first, our opposition stated that prose and dec are good gateway events into learning about speech. However, novice events and meets could actually be a better solution for beginners. Personally, in my 4-year experience in Congress, I have had the ability to compete in 4 years in a single event, and that has made me a much more proficient debater and speaker. So personally, I would think that making yourself proficient in a single event would actually further your success. And while the opposition seems to think that all that this team cares about is winning, winning is a crucial element of speeching. It makes you feel good about yourself. Who in the opposition is going to say that getting the ribbon is not going to make them feel more confident in their speaking skills and their ability to translate an argument? Judges understand this too. Judges understand that they're going to give the best awards to the best speakers. And while we while our points may seem like they're extrinsically motivated, we too are speech kids that want to improve ourselves. And we are working toward that goal of getting a ribbon because it shows improvement. Secondly, they argue that poetry should be cut instead of prose. However, poetry is extremely difficult to analyze and is actually one of the most important skills that are taught in, say, an AP literature class or anything like that. I still have kids that are seniors in high school that still don't understand how to analyze poetry. It is a very difficult skill. So why shouldn't the IHSFA be emphasizing that skill over prose? The opposition stated that prose definitely helps learn plot structure, but you can learn plot structure through HI and DI, which are events that are completely similar to prose, and those should be favored instead, which is why prose should be eliminated. So difficulty isn't necessarily always a hindrance. So as I've stated, instead of poetry, prose should be cut because they are both similar to poi. We do agree that prose and poetry are very similar to the new event poi that we are adding to the event. However, prose offers less of a challenge for competitors, and in addition, it is extremely similar to 2 other events, making it extremely similar to 3 events that are going to be in the IHSFA. So basically, prose is unnecessary and poetry is a valuable skill that students still need to learn. Lastly, the opposition stated that combining the extemps should be the new solution. However, they only had a minute to really elaborate on this claim, so I can't really make any firm assumptions about their point. However, the only point that I have seen is that they said it would make us more like the collegiate level. I don't really understand that point because this is the IHSFA, not the ICFA. We're not a college program. We're trying to better students' learning in focused areas of education. And by combining the extemps, it's extremely difficult for students to have a focused knowledge of domestic and international issues. Yes?
Should the IHSFA be trying to promote lifelong skills, and thusly by combining the extemps, they can prepare them for a college extemp, and then thusly prepare them for their on life, so they go hand in hand.
Well, while I agree that college extemp would be a great experience for kids to learn, I still think that the skill of learning about either domestic extemp or international extemp and delving deeper into those topics would actually be the preferred solution in order to create new skills. Yes?
Wouldn't by combining all 3 extemps, you have 1 round for each individual type of question, actually provide students with a wider range of deeper analyses as well, because you have to provide different analysis for a domestic round, an international round, and an economic round?
Well, personally, I would say that students that do domestic extemp are more inclined to like domestic topics, and if they're forced to have to talk about international topics, that's not why they wanted to do domestic extemp. I have a passion for American politics, not for foreign affairs, and so I think that kids that really want to do domestic extemp should be able to do that without having to learn international extemp. IX is really hard. And to elaborate on our propositions points, we would like to reiterate the fact that it is necessary to eliminate 2 events from the IHSFA tournament. So the opposition has stated that they are going to ignore this claim. However, that gives us one advantage that we can use because they have, we laid a burden on them and they have denied that burden. However, they still only have 1 burden left that they are unable to prove. And they didn't prove it because they did not elaborate on their third contention at all. Secondly, we have already discussed how prose is extremely unnecessary. The opposition states that prose provides the skill of writing your own piece, but so does HI, poetry, DI, and poi. So this argument is clearly invalid. And lastly, we state that declamation is a weaker speech event. Now the opposition states that dec teaches a skill of analyzing and picking out important points of an argument. But I ask you today, what are we doing in this debate event? Debate teaches the skill of analyzing arguments better than any event that I've ever competed in. In Congress, in discussion, you learn to pull ideas from everyone else, you learn to pull arguments from everyone's ideas and pick out the most important points. Declamation isn't the only thing that teaches this skill. Debate teaches this skill. So by removing declamation, we're not necessarily depriving students of learning about argumentation. Debate is one of the best ways to learn about argumentation. There's also loss of crossover for DEC competitors. They could compete in extemp or they could compete in novice OO. The opposition really hasn't discussed our pushing of novice at meets, and they've said that it would be a hindrance. However, the proposition does not believe so, and this is why the proposition should win this case.
I would like to remind everybody here that I am the third speaker on team opposition on the motion that this House believes that in order to add point informative speaking, that the IHSFA must eliminate prose and declamation as events. We'll recapitulate our contentions, which state that we should keep prose and dec as gateway events, get rid of poetry instead of prose, and also combine the extemporaneous speakings. First, looking at the burden that you had given us, you burdened us with either maintaining all 16 events or with showing that declamation and prose are more important than any two other events. With showing alternative events, we have taken the burden of the latter, like my partner has already stated. And your first contention about how it is necessary to remove two events is arbitrary because we have decided to remove two events otherwise. While you stated that we agreed with your first contention, this was only situational and you were given the opportunity to be the first speaker and it has nothing to do with proving an argument. Next, looking at the contentions about how they had stated that prose too closely follows poetry. Prose is less about an argument and more about a theme. However, poetry is more based off of a selection of multiple readings and analysis, which is more like poi than prose. You also showed that how prose is related to HI and DI. However, this debate only includes creating room for poi, whereas prose has already existed along with HI and DI, and they have all three existed at the state level for quite some time. Also, prose contains a plotline which is cut and requires more thought. However, poetry also includes an argument because the speaker must combine different pieces to prove a point. According to the NSDA on poi, the contestant should be able to evaluate on how effective their argument or theme is projected in the total program. This sounds very much closer to a poetry, which provides an argument, whereas a prose is more about a storyline or a theme that they were showing. Also, looking at their rebuttal, that it stated that there are enough novice meets for the students that can compete in. From memory, my first meet did not contain a novice meet, which I realized after signing up. Yes.
But can't we just encourage coaches to have more novice meets as opposed to trying to keep these other events?
We can try to help them have more of them, but in many of the meets that are much smaller, there could be rooms with only 3 people who compete against each other at the same time during the day, so they are only seeing 2 other pieces. It would not improve as much from seeing other people. Also, new members should be allowed to have more beginner events such as prose and dec to look at different opportunities in the different realm. Whereas with having to memorize the piece, they would have to spend more time memorizing instead of looking at limited prep events if they wanted to look at that at the same time. Also, when they say that declamation is a weaker event, it is not because it places emphasis on trying to emulate one person's ideas. In the academic world, you should not write a paper and give no credit to sources you can.
Point.
Yes.
In every interp event, you start by saying the title of the piece and who the author of the piece is. How does this not reinforce citation?
Citation is used in all of them, but declamation is more of looking at a philosophical side of it. Regarding this, when you have talked about removing when it was a weaker event, you had also you had not given any thought into it relating to informative speaking as much, which the NSDA quotes to it. The general purpose of the speech is for the audience to gain understanding and or knowledge of the topic.
Point.
Yes.
Doesn't informative speaking give a knowledge of a topic? That's what it's for.
Yes, it does, but by looking at informative compared to declamation is more, once again, to provide a philosophical point on it, and is much more persuasive than informative, which is more recapitulating what is going on in the world. Which, like our third point had stated, how we should combine both of the extemporaneous speakings instead. It is always important to realize it is always important to know both domestic and international issues at the same time. One question I received during practice was, with all that recent accusations against American police, will this affect America on the global stage? This shows that both American foreign policy and domestic policy both are seen and exhibited in the international community, which shows that they both play a role in each other. And the third round, being economic, such as the collegiate level, provides a third level of analysis on current events. Last, I would like to once again show that our contentions of keeping prose and dec as gateway events provide the opportunity for many people to look at both the realms of interpretive events and limited prep at the same time. Getting rid of poetry also shows that it's too closely related to poi more than prose, and also combining the extemporaneous speakings so that because they more follow an informative relationship of how they are just citing evidence and giving information, whereas declamation is more philosophical and proof.
I am now the fourth and final speaker for team opposition, today stating in opposition of the motion that this House has presented, where in order to acquire more room for poi and informative speaking, prose interpretation and declamation need to be removed. In my closing, I will begin by recapping team opposition's 3 points and showing that this is why, and showing that we have truly won this argument presented before you today. Now, for example, Team Proposition said that we had necessarily agreed with their first contention, which was that it is not feasible to have 16 events. However, as my partner stated before, this was purely situational, as they burdened us with the option of either saying that 16 events is feasible or providing a counter plan and removing 2 other events, which we have effectively done in this argument. Therefore, their argument that we are agreeing with them is, as I have proven, purely situational and not necessarily by our own fault. Secondly, by removing poetry interpretation, we can effectively acclimate more room for poi. Because poetry is so similar to poi with a similar concept of needing to find a theme of two specific pieces that range from a large amount of topics and create an argument surrounding them, you are more likely to have, in order to provide more room for poi, it is more likely to remove poetry, since they can be also used in program of oral interpretation as well, and sort of combine the two without having an entirely separate event for poetry. Also, when it comes in terms of declamation, they have argued that it is a weaker event. However, since it borders so close to original oratory and informative speaking, it actually would sort of strengthen that community as a whole, as we have mentioned earlier, with this common theme of providing an ideological argument and picking out the most important parts, something that doesn't necessarily happen in a DI or HI, as that is more of a performative aspect, and this is more of an informative academic aspect. Lastly, by combining both international and domestic extemporaneous speaking, we can provide more room for both poi and informative, as well as encouraging students to foster broadened horizons when it comes to deeper analysis. Domestic politics and international politics are increasingly intertwined, especially in the United States, as we are a world superpower, and covering that with the blanket of global and domestic economics provides a student that is well-rounded and well-versed in not only 3 different types of analyses, but 3 different types of specific topics and the knowledge of how the 3 intertwine together. As we come to a close, I strongly encourage you to vote for team opposition when it comes to who necessarily has presented a better argument. Thank you.
As a final speaker for Team Proposition, I will begin by explaining where the opposition team went wrong and finally explaining how Team Proposition has won today's debate. To begin with, Team Opposition did not present their 3rd point until the last minute of their 2nd speech, clearly demonstrating how they were not properly organized and prepared for today's debate. This should have been brought up much earlier so they could have had more time to elaborate on it, and they didn't have the chance to, and it was therefore a very weak point. In addition to that, the only real reason they brought up was the fact that it is done at the collegiate level. However, we have stated that this is not the collegiate level, this is high school, and it's important that students have the chance to differentiate whatever topic they would like to focus in. That's an important skill, and extemp is important in itself and therefore should not be combined together so more people can compete in it. Secondly, they provided this huge contradiction of why they like prose. They like it because it's not memorized. It offers the students the chance to have a script in front of them, yet they also are supporting declamation, which is a memorized event, clearly showing that memorization is an important technique that students should learn and should be able to practice. And thirdly, they misinterpreted our burden. Our second part of our burden was to prove that prose and declamation were more important to keep than any other two events. However, we strongly disagree with their points brought up, which brings me into why we won this debate. Prose and declamation are not more important than any other events because, one, prose is very similar to other events. There are going to be 3 now with the inclusion of poi that are so similar to prose, and because of that, it's unnecessary. It's just excessive. In addition, declamation is not teaching the unique skills. They said that they talked about the skills that declamation does teach. However, we brought up that those skills can be taught through the other events, such as debate, or even poi now, in informative speaking. Secondly, they have discussed how prose and declamation offer gateway events. However, we have disproven that. For one, prose is very populated, it's very hard to be successful in, and secondly, we've offered another plan to help improve this, which is by offering more novice events and encouraging meets to have that event so that people can have more experience in those events. And finally, they have chosen to get rid of poetry and extemp. However, as Team Proposition, we stand in firm support of poetry and extemporaneous speaking because they teach very valuable skills. Those are not events that we should be getting rid of. They teach analysis, they teach quick thinking, and the extemps. Those are important events, and they're definitely more important than prose and declamation to keep in the competition. And therefore, the opposition has failed to meet our burden and with their interpretation of it, and that is why Team Proposition has won today's debate.
So, did you get a handout? Are there any questions that you guys have for me or any of the kids about what happened, about World School strategy or anything like that? You guys aren't asking.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What is the convention about holding up the hand for?
It is something that they do at the world and national level. That's just sort of.
It's the class X, it's a right class X.
But
I understand what they're asking questions.
it's just something that that has come about through world and national.
And the same with the applause
Yes.
during is something that's
It's
by the
something
rules.
that they're identifying that they think is a worthwhile or a really good point their teammate has made.
There, if you notice, the style is part of the, and style is not just speaking style, but it's also how you interact up front also. So that's part of the style point. So knocking on your table is part of the style.
I actually have a question for the performers. Do you find it distracting in any way when you've competed as far as the way that people treat points of information? The way that they're responding? Has that ever been problematic for you? Or how do you react to when someone stands up?
I mean, we've been taught if you're in the middle of a point, you should continue with that point so you don't lose your train of thought. I think I did that a little bit up there as well, but he was still left standing and I could still answer the question. But it's just kind of like you learn to block it out until you finish your point and then you can acknowledge the point. It's just kind of something you learn.
With the points, we tell you should answer at least, you should answer 2. And then, all others, if you answer, is sort of taken away from your time. And it's also a strategy for either side to keep popping up to try to throw you off. So it can be a strategy that way also.
And then the other follow-up that I had was, one of the things that we do a lot in the debate world is to follow up on their answers to your point of information in your next speech. Is that something that you see done a lot in competition? I know this is a new event for you guys too. But is that something that you frequently cite to, say, hey, we've raised this point, they haven't really addressed it with their, is it popular? Anyway.
I'm the only one who's ever actually competed with it at nationals, but that did happen from time to time. If it wasn't fully answered, you could come back the next time and fully explain that to make sure that it wasn't just left unanswered or to show that they didn't fully answer your question.
Other questions? All right, what I think is a pretty cool event that a lot of kids can do. And again, I use it in my classroom for, it's an easier style debate to learn than the conventional ones that we've been using here. So,